focus to other stories that we are tracking is where the United States has halted the funding for the COVID lab based in Wuhan in China. The federal funding for the Wuhan Institute of Virology was stopped after it allegedly failed to provide documents about safety and security measures. The Department of Health and Human Services in US also warned the lab to cut off the funding permanently, alleging that the Chinese facility isn't complying with the federal regulations. And to discuss this further, I'm joined by our guest, Mr. Atul Aneja, who is the editor of Indian Narrative. Well, thank you. Good afternoon. I beg your pardon. Good morning. And thank you for taking our time and joining us over here, Mr. Aneja. Now, clearly, as far as the US Department is concerned, they have been carrying out a review since last September about the working of the Wuhan Institute of Virology in connection to the COVID outbreak. The decision to cut down the funding has only come after they failed to provide the due documents of safety and the lack of transparency. That's a legitimate reason for a federal funding to be stopped for any institution that does not comply with the federal rules.
Yes, I think so. In fact, if you go a little behind, I mean, if you track the story earlier, I think there were enough suspicions of lack of transparency of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And there were other elements as well, which had come under a cloud. So I think the case for stopping funding to Wuhan Institute of Virology existed for quite some time. And I'm a little surprised it has come so late.
But this is not the first time around that China has actually tried to stonewall information and has not really complied with the rules and regulation or provided with the requisite documents to try and rule out any area of suspicion. And that is exactly why the needle of suspicion rises, indicates and directs it a lot more towards China. Do you think that there should be a larger investigation into what exactly happened at the Wuhan lab?
I think there's a case for a larger investigation. There's no doubt about it. My own view, having analyzed this and studied this for some time, is that this appears to be a case of lab leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And there are reasons why it seems to be the case, because there were experiments which are called gain of function experiments, which are essentially experiments on viruses, dangerous animal viruses, and how they can mutate and infect humans. This dates back to 2015. This is something which we know was going on. In fact, in collaboration with the Americans, there was a scientist, there's a lady called Zhang Li, who was the chief nodal person in these experiments in 2015, along with Ralph S. Barrick. And they had jointly worked on how to work on the SARS-1 virus. If you recall that China and other countries were impacted majorly by SARS-1 much earlier. But the experiment which was going on was how to use the spike of SARS-1 and embed it with the spike of a bat virus. I mean, those experiments were going on at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. This is a matter of record. I'm quoting from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists where this has been recorded. So those experiments were going on for some time. Then when we actually had the COVID-19 outbreak, which was, as it's scientifically called, SARS-CoV-2 or SARS-2. There was a time when there was a lack of transparency. I mean, the records of the experiments, gain of function experiments were wiped out. About the lady who was involved, her data was completely wiped out. In fact, there was a manipulation about the WHO teams which went in for investigation. The Chinese kept arguing that it is a natural evolution, whereas there's enough data and suspicion that these kind of gain of function experiments were going on in Wuhan Institute of Virology. So this is something which was on record. Now to get to the final that this was actually happening needed more transparency from the Chinese side to reveal more information about the functioning. And that's where the Chinese go completely inward looking and stop sharing of data. The entire data files were wiped out from these experiments in Wuhan Institute of Virology. That leads to the suspicion that indeed there was an experiment on SARS-2, which was going on over there. And I think that because of the lack of transparency, the Americans have finally come to the conclusion that they no longer can carry out the funding of Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Mr. Aneja, you've mentioned something very interesting, that if there's such an experiment that was already going on, then was this also not incumbent upon the US authorities to monitor how their funding is being used? Like, what is the research that is being carried out to understand which way the Wuhan Institute and many other such institutes, what we are given to understand that 15 such entities have been debarred from the US funding in 2020, Wuhan Institution being one of those. Should there not be a monitoring committee to see what is the funding being used for?
I think the Americans have a lot of answering, frankly, as do the Chinese. Chinese, of course, the needle of culpability lies there. But the backstory of how certain US institutions were involved in funding these experiments, well, these are actually legitimate experiments which is used for medicine, etc. But the safety of the lab and the transparency about it, you see, what was happening was these experiments were carried out in something called the BSL-2 lab, which does not have the kind of measures or equipment to make foolproof that whatever experiments are carried out remain confined to the lab. So, I mean, these are the issues which the Americans should have woken up much earlier. And I think your point is very well taken, that there has to be a broader international probe into this, and to unearth all the elements which have gone to this unfortunate issue of COVID-19, which has claimed millions of people's lives. I think there is a legitimate ground for a bigger and wider probe into it.
But there were 7 million people, Mr. Aneja, who lost their lives due to the pandemic. Yes. Is there no sense of responsibility for China then to be able to provide and cooperate with the documents of safety, security, what safeguards were used to ensure that if the experiments are not successful, then what is going to be the predicament of it? Is there no responsibility that perhaps the international authorities can exhort upon China to comply?
Well, you can bar funding for China. I mean, you can impose sanctions on China. But frankly, countries like China, given the size of the economy, etc., and the interdependence of the world on China, frankly, I'm quite skeptical that you can really impose physical pain on China. But there is also beyond the actual sanctions, etc. There's a moral story as well, and I think the Chinese who have been arguing that this was a case of natural evolution of a virus, I think when the suspicion is there, they need to come clean. And if they have a story to tell, I mean, let the world know about it. To be very honest, I do not subscribe to the view, given my detailed study of this, that the Chinese deliberately leaked the virus. I mean, I don't think that really, it's a biological warfare weapon used by the Chinese, because Chinese themselves have been hit very badly. But I do think that these experiments were carried out without following the right kind of protocols. And this has caused a lab leak from China, and for which the Chinese are responsible, because you cannot hold these kind of experiments knowing fully well the kind of enormous damage to humanity it can cause. So it is a crime against humanity. Now, whether you did it deliberately or it was an accident, which I think it was, in any case, you are culpable and you need to come clean.
Well, absolutely, Mr. Aneja. Thank you for taking our time and joining us over here at Mirror Now to discuss and put things into perspective as far as US cutting down the funding of the Wuhan Institute of Virology and what are going to be the after effects of it, whether China is going to learn a lesson through it or would it find more ways to try and keep themselves afloat. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Aneja, for joining us here.